Tamam. Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to take 5 more minutes to start in order to wait for people to come. Thank you very much.
Hayır hayır onu değil. Tamam. Salonun sesi aç.
Good morning. Welcome, all of you, and thank you for being here to this workshop on evaluating multi-stakeholder mechanisms to address governance issues. As a matter of introduction, the evolution of Internet governance principles, frameworks, and accountability mechanisms has been the focus of considerable discussion in 2014. This process must proceed through careful analysis. Some governments highlighted concern about Internet-related policy issues for which they cannot identify relevant existing mechanisms.
Just trying to take existing gaps in those mechanisms and then think of way forward, how to enhance them, how to possibly change them, whether we need new mechanisms or not, and so forth. This discussion actually does not take place only at the IGF. It takes place at several internet governance fora, including the organization I come from, including ICANN. Today, if any of you following the ICANN sort of discussions, you would have heard about ICANN accountability. This is a big issue today at ICANN, and all community members are taking part in this discussion. And it takes place at other organizations as well. So I think it's important while we're having this discussion, as I said, is to refer also to some of the work that took place in other fora about mechanisms and evaluating of mechanisms, about also evaluating of the IGF itself. So more than 2 or 3 years ago, a working group was established under the CSTD at the UN to sort of evaluate the IGF and propose recommendations on how to improve the IGF. And the working group came up with specific recommendations on enhancing or improving the IGF from its working methodologies to how to improve participation from developing countries, how to diversify funding resources, how to strengthen the outcomes of the IGF and make them more tangible. Today, we're seeing some of those improvements being established. We've seen some more tangible and more visible outcomes coming out of the IGF and so forth. Another example was a CSTD working group on enhanced cooperation that also looked into the very issue of mechanisms, and I'm sure that other panelists will talk to that in more detail. So in a nutshell, the discussion about internet governance mechanisms and enhancing cooperation among stakeholders is, and in my opinion, should be an ongoing discussion. There isn't a point when we're going to say, okay, we're done, okay, it's finished. I don't see this point, or I don't see any possibility of reaching to this point at any time, because, as I said, the internet itself it's an evolving phenomenon, and it will continue to be like that. So it's very important while we're looking into processes to ensure that the main principles are maintained, openness, multi-stakeholder processes, bottom-up, accountability, transparency, and so forth. And these also are the same principles that the Net Mondial event has adopted. So let's, continue the discussion, and let's all work on, doing our best to continue to improve the internet governance mechanisms, not only at the global level, but more importantly, or as importantly, at national and regional levels. Let's not forget that many of the internet governance issues we're discussing here at the IGF have more to do with national sort of environments and policies. So I'll stop here and we'll give the chance to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. And I take from what you said how important is the linkage between multi-stakeholderism and accountability, and how important is that, and it's important to reinforce that. I will ask now Joy Lidicott to take the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you. Kia ora, Joy Lidicott from Association for Progressive Communications. And thank you, Bahira. I really liked your reference mechanisms. Are we here? Is this it? And I really strongly resist that urge. So I like this notion of evolution. My problem with the notion of evolution is that it's the creationism theory has it that it's survival of the fittest. And in this process, I don't believe that's the case. APC's done, particularly in looking at multi-stakeholder processes in human rights in the last year, and certainly since the last IGF. So what trends can we see? What are we seeing in this process of evolution, and what deductions or conclusions can we make from this that help us in framing principles that we might be able to agree on? I think that in terms of the first one around human rights, I think we have also seen a change in multi-stakeholder processes where we're bringing in human rights discussions which we haven't seen before. I think we're also seeing new kinds of rights, not only references, for example, to freedom of expression, but increasingly the question of economic rights, of social rights and of cultural rights being talked about in multi-stakeholder discussions. And these are very important issues for those in developing countries, for example. And we're starting to see in the Freedom Online Coalition, for example, references to economic, cultural and social rights principles. So I see growth, I see an expansion in the kinds of principles that are being articulated, and I also see growth in the places where multi-stakeholder itself is being referenced. So for example, we see just last month in the United Nations Human Rights Council, the High Commissioner for Human Rights in her report on the right to privacy in the digital age specifically calls for multi-stakeholder input and multi-stakeholder engagement to respond to the challenges of mass surveillance and the right to privacy in the digital age. This is extraordinary because this is a new discourse to have these member state bodies referring to multi-stakeholder processes and engagement and calling on them and asking for help with them. So, and I think there are a range of mechanisms that are really there to assist these other spaces like the Council with this. So again, I see this evolution. I see the principle of multi-stakeholderism itself being taken on in other places. Now, this is not to say that this is a seamless process. It's not without challenge, without confusion, without contesting what is multi-stakeholderism. And we saw many, many submissions detailing dozens and dozens of places where multi-stakeholder mechanisms and processes are discussing not only human rights but other things. And we'll talk more about that. So, with that rather optimistic, if not uncritical opening remarks, I'll pass back to the Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I really take the concept that the multi-stakeholder revolution must not be Darwinian, yeah, but be inclusive, and that adding the dimension of human rights into that would produce, will help us navigate that way. So it's very, very interesting. Thank you very much. I will now ask. I lost my. Yeah, Phil Ruston to take the floor now, please.
Okay, and good morning, everyone. Building on Bahir and Joy's presentations, I think it's fair to say that are we going to arrive at a destination, or are we just going to have a continual journey and discuss and try and finalise what we mean by enhanced cooperation, by mechanisms that support enhanced cooperation? And I think the answer to that is when the internet stops growing and evolving, then you probably will come up with a finite set of rules about internet governance. And I think as the technology is used differently, as the technology invades everybody's life to greater and greater degrees, then what we mean by internet governance or governance associated with the internet will actually change. Joy and Behir mentioned the CSTD work, and that started about 18 months ago. And like all good activities where you don't know what you're doing to begin with, you're in a brand new landscape, we had to describe what our process was going to be. And there were difficult discussions around that. But what we did in the first step was we said, well, what are the issues associated with internet governance and governance of the internet? And that generated 200 plus issues. So faced with 200 plus issues, we took the next best step and said, are some of these similar? And yes, they are. They're not all the same, and there are subtle differences, there are major differences. And we got the 200 issues down to 24. And as part of that process, we said, well, if there are these 24 very broad areas, are there not some discussions going on somewhere that relate to the internet in these areas? And when we went and asked colleagues in the wider world than just the CSTD, the answer was yes, there were. And we created, thanks to Leah Casper and Sam Dickinson, a very detailed spreadsheet of mechanisms that exist in these 24 broad areas. And I think one of the things that you have with this spreadsheet is a good starting point to begin the evaluation. It's not complete, and some would argue that it's not perfect, but it is there. And by going out and just asking people, give us examples of what you understand by a mechanism, we got some really interesting answers. And the one that struck me, and it's so blindingly obvious, was the role of Interpol in some of the issues that people associated with crime. Now, Interpol exists, everybody knows that it exists, but it's not central to what you would consider internet governance. And it has a role. And maybe that's an indication of where you have to start thinking about evaluating the mechanisms. It's not necessarily those mechanisms that are central, but perhaps it's mechanisms that touch upon the internet, that have their own central role in a totally different universe to ours, but we come into collision at some point. And it's understanding the relationships between our world and these other worlds that I think is an important step to take in any future evaluation. I think the examples and evidence that we've got thus far in a spreadsheet are good. I think it could be done with more evidence and information. And I would say if anybody thinks that they have any more examples of mechanisms where enhanced cooperation or of internet governance exists, come and see me afterwards and we'll see how we can get the data incorporated into the spreadsheet. Because I think going forward, it's understanding the relationship between specific mechanisms, both of our world and of other worlds, be they legal, fiscal, when you have to go and pay your taxes to those nice people in the inland, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and understanding that they have a role in their world, we need to have a linkage into our world. Understanding that relationship becomes quite critical. So I think the position I'm left with is, whilst there are mechanisms that exist, we do need to understand whether or not they are complete, whether or not they are truly global, whether they deal with regional. And I think we have to talk about mechanisms in the plural, because rather like the internet, it is not just one thing. It is many things brought together. And I think that's how the governance reflects the internet And I think going forward, as that internet evolves, so those mechanisms will also evolve along with the internet. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Phil. I would say that even though the internet is just one, there is no central authority of the internet, and it's a distributed network. So a distributed network might need distributed mechanisms too. So that would be a good take from what you said. Thank you very much. I would ask now Jandir to address the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Good morning to you all. And I was asked to provide you with an example of a multi-stakeholder mechanism to address governance. And I must say this was particularly interesting, given my professional background. I'm a diplomat. I was trained in a multilateral environment. I work at the UN in New York. So I was taught that the multilateral tools that we had in the UN negotiations will be able to solve all problems and questions we have in the international community. But I was wrong, and this is something I learned with internet. And that's what I think makes internet so fascinating, because you realize the multilateral tools are just not enough for the complexity of issues at stake. And when it comes to a concrete example of how a multilateral, multi-stakeholder approach can really break new ground, I would like to comment on the recent Net Mundial event that was held in Brazil last April. Perhaps some of you might have attended. And the first thing I would like to say was not a conference of Brazil, but was a conference in Brazil, organized with the support of a multi-stakeholder group. And I think that was a very practical and successful application of the multi-stakeholder approach, because representatives from different stakeholders were able to get together, to talk to each other, to listen to each other, and they negotiated in good faith an outcome document. And this Net Mundial proved that this was doable and this was possible, and then a multi-stakeholder approach can be outcome-oriented. This is an ongoing discussion here at the IGF, as we all know. And I think the lessons we learned in São Paulo perhaps could be useful to us, and they are still being discussed, and I think they'll continue to be discussed in the future. And then I wonder, and then you might wonder as well, perhaps what the reasons for the success in Net Mundial. And I think there are several reasons for that. If I could just point some of them, I think one essential point is that the people that were involved in the negotiations in the Net Mundial, from the different stakeholders, they were driven by a common goal of finding common ground. And instead of focusing on the issues that divide the different groups, they try to focus on a common approach. And this was possible, and then they were really able to come together with a concrete outcome. Sometimes of course they agreed to disagree on some issues, but rather they focus on what brings them together. And the preparation process, the mechanisms which were at stake, I think they were very important for the success of the event. Because even though people think that Net Mundial was a 2-day conference, the negotiations of the documents, they started like months in advance. They were really focused, the questions were identified in advance. The group had to come together to produce a set of principles on internet governance, as well as a roadmap for the future evolution of an internet governance, so that the objectives were very clear, so people knew in advance what to expect when they got to São Paulo. And this, I think, added a predictability to the process. And not to mention that the negotiations were transparent, were inclusive, people were able to follow on the ground how the documents were evolving, And this again added legitimacy to this exercise. Of course, not everybody was satisfied, but our view, in the view of many of the participants in São Paulo, is that we managed to break new ground, and then the lessons we learned could be useful to different fora. And once I was asked if the Net Mundial created a new multi-stakeholder model to address internet governance, and I was thinking, and this perhaps is the answer is yes and no. No, because there's no single multi-stakeholder approach to address this range of challenges we have in internet governance. And perhaps yes, because the Net Mundial was able to provide us with some innovation to address these issues. And this could help to lead us to new lessons in the future for internet governance. So I think São Paulo helped us, put us on the right track, but of course there are many challenges ahead, and mainly how the principles and the roadmap that was produced in São Paulo, they can help feed into the other processes currently going on, including the IGF. There are many questions ahead of us, and I'll be happy to continue discussing that in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jandir. And I take that, how important is your declaration that the governments are discovering a new world, a new ground, and how important it's for non-governmental actors also to discover the governmental world. You know, how important is that interrelation. Thank you very much. I will ask now Mohamed El-Dashan to give us some remarks. Mohamed, please.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mohamed El-Dashan. And, well, the internet will always evolve faster than bureaucracy. That's a good starting point to agree on. And as such, it's very easy to have the impulse that, well, if we have issues popping up very rapidly, then it makes more sense to create new institutions and new bureaucratic mechanisms. And I stress on the word bureaucratic and attach it to mechanism because very much, most of the time, this is what it is. And people do that on the assumption that, well, whatever new we create will always be better. Now, of course, the new will always be better is a position held by a lot of people, and it always fails when you tell them that, you know, fine, then you will drink the new one, I'll drink the old one. But that also means that if we're going to focus on the existing mechanisms, which seems to be a good approach, then we need to be very honest about what the problems with the current mechanisms are and what their weaknesses are. And looking at that very large list of mechanisms that was developed by the review process of the working group on enhanced cooperation that was mentioned earlier, you will notice that many of those institutions are, one, they're very partial. They are as far as can be from, many of them are as far as can be from multi-stakeholder, at most pluri-stakeholder if you wish that term. They're partial, they're nested, so they're a sub-institution within a sub-institution of a UN Commission, which necessarily entails that it's difficult to access, it's difficult for a lot of the stakeholders that we're trying to engage to access those institutions, thinking of the developing world, thinking of academia, thinking of the civil society. And, well, as we said, if it's not, and even those are not particularly are not particularly multi-stakeholder. I mean, the IGF is as multi-stakeholder as it can get, really. And even here, we are all well aware that there's a number of voices that we would hope were included at the table and often aren't. So the problem becomes not just the absence of mechanisms, but it's whether the stakeholders we are trying to engage actually trust those mechanisms enough. Joy was talking that it's not survival of the fittest, and I completely agree. Very largely, it will be survival of the leanest, survival of the most flexible. the purpose isn't to centralize mechanisms or to add layers, even though that might be very tempting, but it would be the real challenge that we're faced is to see what we can do with the existing mechanisms to make the variety of stakeholders more comfortable with them. And by doing this, we need to have a very clear dialogue with those stakeholders about what really is the issue, what are the underlying trust issues there that makes them uncomfortable with existing mechanisms, and then somehow sort of tinker with the DNA of those institutions to make sure that they are that they become more flexible and answer the needs of a larger group of stakeholders. So this is the main challenge that we're looking at right now. We want to make the existing mechanisms more open to participation, more open to criticism, and more open to accountability review. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think you put the emphasis on the trust of the existing mechanisms and how extended is that trust into the stakeholders, and that's a very interesting perspective. So we are now, we're great in time. Yeah, excellent. So I would ask Chris Buckridge to help us start the discussion. So Chris, please.
Okay, thank you. My name's Chris Buckridge. I'm from the RIPE NCC. We're the regional internet registry in Europe. I gather my role here today is sort of to inspire a bit the discussion here. Having listened to the speakers and heard what they said, I don't think there's necessarily, I'm sure people here are going to have a lot of questions already, so I'll try and keep this quite brief, and maybe just a few questions that sort of came to me or were inspired by what I heard here. I think one of the first things that really sort of I wanted to sort of touch on and think about is this idea that Phil had, that these are mechanisms in plural that we're talking about, and that this is an ongoing evolution, that this is not going to be something where we reach an end point. And I think that sort of is a really key point about how we address this, both in terms of thinking about, is it mechanisms versus institutions? There's the discussion about, do we need new institutions in internet governance, or can we look at using the existing institutions and perhaps coming up with new mechanisms under that? And I think the IANA stewardship process is perhaps an example that I'd be interested to hear what the panelists think, what other people think about. Obviously using ICANN as a sort of convening force, but it's something separate to ICANN processes, so it's a bit of a new or an interesting twist on that. And are these sort of temporary groupings the more useful, the more dynamic or flexible way to go? And I think Net Mundial is also an example of that. That I mean, there has been discussion about, is this Net Mundial, or there was more discussion previously about, is Net Mundial a new forum in an ongoing way, or is it something that happened, was a one-off event that sort of sparked then new discussions? And so I think in answering that, we do come back to the central point of this workshop, which is how do we evaluate all of those mechanisms. And I think Joy's comments about it not necessarily being survival of the fittest, I think made me think a bit there. And I don't necessarily disagree, but at the same time, I guess when your perspective on survival of the fittest makes it sound like the strongest taking over or beating down the weakest. Whereas I guess, is it perhaps more useful to think about it as survival of the fittest being the need to sort of winnow down from experimentation, from lots of different mechanisms, to find some efficiencies there, that if we're going forward, if there is no one-size-fits-all for addressing these issues, do we need a way to identify what works and what doesn't, so that we're not starting over from scratch every time? I think, Joy, you also commented, and others as well, on how much multi-stakeholderism is being adopted, or at least referenced, or attempts to integrate it into so many quite high-level organizations now. And Phil's point about Interpol, I think, raised an interesting question about do all of these venues need to be multi-stakeholder? What do we mean by multi-stakeholder? How rigid are we about our definition of what that actually means? I don't imagine Interpol sees themselves as multi-stakeholder, but at the same time, I do know from personal experience that they are reaching out, talking to others in the technical community, for instance. And so then, I guess, finally, breaking that down further to the logistics of how we do this evaluation. One question, I think, is what do we need to think about as a sort of prerequisite or a sort of common element in these different mechanisms about how we can then evaluate those mechanisms. I think obviously transparency in what's going on, sharing information is key to that so that we actually know what a process involved and then whether that works going forward. But are there any other elements that we need to be thinking of as common here? And I guess the other question is the venue for this evaluation. Who does the evaluation? Where does it happen? The CSTD obviously was mentioned, and there are a couple of examples there within that forum, but without any prejudice here, is that the best place? Is that the only place? Do we need to have a single venue for that evaluation to take place, or does it matter if it's more dispersed with different communities doing their own evaluations? And then what is also the methodology? I think, Phil, your reference to the way the CSTD Working Group on Enhanced Cooperation produced that spreadsheet is a really useful example, but are there others that people have thought about or developed? So, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Any reaction? Who would like to react? Phil, please.
Thank you. I think, Chris, you're right, and I think putting on the comments of others on the panel, I think you can't ever say what's going to work or not work in terms of governance. Also, I think it's not necessarily the fact that every governance issue entity is multi-stakeholder. I think it's the linkages between them. Interpol is the obvious one we've mentioned, and I cite it because somebody quoted it into the CSTD. I think my colleague here said it best when he said, you know, if you look at Net Mundial, we had principles up front, it was open, and as you evolve governance issues, you start from a blank, if there's nothing there, you're going to start from a blank sheet. And therefore it's saying the first issue you're going to have, as we found in CSTD, was how do we do this? What's the first issue? What are the questions we should be asking, and to whom should we be asking it? And it's only by going through that process and understanding that every time you look around and you say, well, there's nothing that does this, or what is there doesn't suit what it is we as a community or as a group of people want to do, then having those principles of openness, transparency, and preparation in activity helps progress understanding. And I think we should always, and it's an ongoing activity, I think, to continually look at what's there. And to pick up on one point that you said was, I think it's not just one place, and there never should be, I believe, just one place. I think it's all the places together have to work together nationally, regionally, internationally to make this work, and that just will be an evolving journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have Peter here, and after here.
I'm Peter Major. I'm the chair of the Working Group on Enhanced Cooperation of the CSTD. Well, just to give you some insight, the working group itself was a multi-stakeholder, or is a multi-stakeholder working group itself. In fact, this is the second multi-stakeholder group in the CSTD, and this time I think we had no problems with the participation in a UN organization from all parties of the internet community. Now, as for the working group, after 4 meetings, which during a 1-year period, we managed to come up with a questionnaire, and based on the questionnaire, the responses to the questionnaire, the correspondence group extracted all the issues, which Phil mentioned, the 200 plus issues, and they just reduced it to 24. And the whole process was quite open. So we arranged to have responses from the whole community. At the very beginning, it was an open process with observers, and everybody could contribute. Now, the purpose of the issues and to identify mechanisms is simply to find out what are the gaps. We didn't go into detail whether these were multi-stakeholder mechanisms. Well, that wasn't the objective of the whole exercise. The exercise itself aimed to identify existing ones, let it be regional, let it be global, and find out if there are areas which are not covered. Now, the CSTD and after the ECOSOC in its resolution gave the task to the CSTD Secretariat to complete the analysis and to come up with a kind of database on the existing mechanisms. And, of course, to identify the gaps. And this work is going to be carried over to the intersessional meeting of the CSTD. And personally, I'm confident that the whole process is going to be continued in an open way. So as for the work of the Secretariat, they are doing it their way, but probably after the intersessional meeting, there will be a discussion, and following the discussion, I really hope that the whole issue will be made public. I will do my best that even before the discussion, all the results will be made public, and the whole community could contribute to these results, could comment, and probably we shall carry on with the work. I don't think this is a closed work, it's an open-ended work, and we have to continue in this way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have the lady in light blue. Would you please identify yourself?
Sure. I'm Ana Neves from Portugal. On top of what has been said, I would like to underline something. We are only talking here about hard law. I think that one of the most important things at the current moment is more soft law.
Put the mic up.
Okay, is soft law.
Pointed to.
Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Okay. Meaning that we have several documents, we have several movements, but the language that each other is using is not perceived by the others, so we are not achieving our target. So I think that when nobody is obliged to do anything, it's so much easier to do something. Meaning, for instance, we had a high-level meeting of ministers on Monday, and everybody was really angry because they were not invited, and etc. At a certain moment, everybody was invited. Nobody was there. So once you feel that you are not part of something, so you are against. When you feel that you are part, so your behavior, your attitude changes. So, and I think that in evaluating these governance issues, it's much more complex and or simple, or maybe simple, because I think that we are now at a stage where we see even people asking for non-governance, that we don't need any governance of the internet. So the discussion is not developing, I think, in the right way. So I just would like to point it out. The soft law important here, the importance of soft law here, and I'm talking about confidence and trust between the different stakeholders. And I'm talking here about confidence and trust between the different governments, the different members of the civil society, the different members of the private sector, because we are all different. And I can't say that I totally agree with the governments and against civil society, because I'm not against anybody. So we all have our values, and that is something that we are not really working. We are here, but we don't know each other. So we have to have more meetings or fora where these kind of discussions are more deep, and when we feel more confident and to trust in ourselves. Well, in a nutshell, not only hard law or documents, but soft law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any reaction for these two comments from the panel? Yeah, Joy?
Thank you. Firstly, just to acknowledge you, Peter, as the chair of the CCD working group, and I would say that if there is an afterlife, I think it has a very special place for those who are chairs of such processes. It was a long process, and it was a rich process with diverse stakeholders working very hard on those outcomes. So thank you for those inputs. And I think one point to note about that, I think, is that we sort of see this tussle around the idea of these diverse mechanisms and many forms, and this debate about whether there needs to be a mechanism of mechanisms, almost. This idea of whether there needs to be a single mechanism where all mechanisms drive towards, or some sort of network of networks, if you like. And I resist such an urge myself. I more in the spectrum of views, which are that we must watch and see what happens in this evolving process, rather than think, because it's got all these mechanisms, we need to create some place for it. So the mapping exercise, I think, has been very useful for seeing that and answering this question of gaps and so on. And also, I think in terms of soft law, I completely agree. I think soft law, codes of practice, sharing best practice, case studies, particularly for small developing countries, enable space to ask questions and build bodies of hard law. So I agree with that. And I think, just going back to the evolution point, certainly there are different forms of evolution. It's not only survival of the fittest, it's also survival of the most beautiful, the best mating dance, you know, all those things which allow, you know, animals, people to flourish. But I think what we've seen, and we're seeing at this IGF in particular, is a new evolution. So the Gender Dynamic Coalition, for example, has launched a set of evolving feminist principles for the internet, with women's groups and women's organisations saying we also are stakeholders and we want to contribute. So I completely agree, this process is not at an end, and neither would I want to see it end in the sense of stop such flourishing and growth either.
Thank you very much. Maher.
Yeah, just very quickly on the multi-stakeholder kind of mechanism or process. I think we also need to acknowledge that processes are not all the same, even though they're multi-stakeholder processes, but they're not the same. So CSTD process is definitely not exactly the same as another process at ITU, ICANN, IETF, and so forth. There are differences, and I think what part of the problem that community members in general, they are kind of accustomed to certain processes, so they when go outside their sort of comfort zones and participate in different kind of processes, then problem arise or problems arise. Same with the Net Mondial. Net Mondial, the principles and the roadmap were reached by consensus. Again, consensus-driven processes are not very common in many organizations that, you know, who claim to be multi-stakeholder and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is that I think recognizing the difference between organizations and processes is important, and that does not mean that, you know, this process is less multi-stakeholder than the other, but I guess also it's fair to say that there are general principles, and again, principles were included in the Net Mondial document that we should strive to maintain and to instill in all, if possible, internet governance processes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I have a comment from the gentleman there on the center.
I'll try and make this quick, since I am aware we don't have that very much time. My name is Pranesh Prakash. I work with the Center for Internet and Society in India. I'd like to apologize, I missed the first speaker, so this might have been addressed. While I saw acknowledgement of differences within multi-stakeholderism, but there seemed to be a shared understanding of what multi-stakeholderism means, whereas I'm very unclear what how the panelists were deploying that word. Do you need to have stakeholder groups for something to be considered multi-stakeholder, or would a grouping of individuals, such as the Internet Engineering Task Force, also be considered multi-stakeholder? What about, do you need different groups, etc., to have an equal footing for something to be considered multi-stakeholder, or would different footing based on different roles also be considered multi-stakeholder? These kinds of questions I think are very important, and I actually don't think there is a shared understanding of multi-stakeholderism, even though we actually use the word very commonly. The second point was I didn't see that very much evaluation. Just taking the IGF, for instance, if you go through the IGF mandate, you could ask questions such as, what advice has the IGF or the IGF process provided to any of the stakeholders about ways and means of accelerating the availability and affordability of the internet in developing countries? Or has the IGF helped find any solutions to the issues arising from the use and misuse of the internet? These are directly from the mandate of the IGF, right? Answering these questions could provide us an evaluation of the functioning of the IGF, yet I don't see people actually doing much of this kind of evaluation. Lastly, the relationship, one other component of an evaluation would be the relationship between multi-stakeholder mechanisms of governance and other kinds of mechanisms of governance, such as trade treaties, for instance, where intermediary liability provisions are being put, discussions happening in the World Intellectual Property Organization on similar topics, etc. And this relationship is, I would say, a necessary part of the evaluation of whether what's happening in places like IGF and CSTD, etc., are affecting what governments are doing at the end of the day in form of hard law, or whether they aren't affecting them at all. So, and I'd like to see a bit more of that.
Thank you very much. I have a comment from the lady over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Anne-Marie Buzatu, and I work for the Swiss organization, the Geneva Center for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces, which is a security policy research institution in Geneva. I'm coming to the IG space from, I'm relatively new, but my expertise is actually in developing multi-stakeholder governance mechanisms and models. And so I'm very interested in this paper and this comparison of different models that you have put together. I was a little bit late in coming, and I'm wondering how I can get a copy of it, because I would like to see it. And I'm also curious if you include in there some of the models that we've been working on at our institution. So I'll leave it there, but mainly my question is, where can I get the paper?
Thank you. Yeah, please.
If you come and see me afterwards, we'll talk about that. Anybody else can come and chat as well, and I can share with you the paper. Going back on to what is multi-stakeholderism, in answer to gentleman's input, saying, could it be, is it the ITF, a multi-stakeholder group of individuals? The answer is, I think it's rather like the mechanisms that we've been talking about in CSTD, multi-stakeholderism is relevant to that organisation. So I think there is no one definition in my mind of what multi-stakeholderism means. I think it's the meeting of individuals, of groups, trying in activities central to the internet to do activities, and trying to outreach, and we keep mentioning Interpol because that's the one I remember, to other areas that are not central but impact our universe. And I think the term universe is one of those things it's big enough to cover everything you want it to cover. And my universe will be different to your universe. But that's why it's a journey, I think. And that's, as we evolve and as we get better at understanding what it is our universes are about, then I think that discussion and that understanding of how those mechanisms work together will become more and more critical, and therefore distilling out what they actually impact and how they impact will be central to understanding the core activities to what the internet is about. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Any other reactions to these two comments from here?
Just quickly.
Okay. Quickly, and I go with you, Sylvia, and we close.
Sorry, thanks. Pranesh, thanks for your question. I think it's an important one. What is the definition of multi-stakeholderism? Who are the multiple stakeholders? Are they individuals? Are they collectives? I think I always think about that question in the context of what's the definition of democracy? And I think there is no single definition of democracy. There is no single form of democracy. There are many, many different ways in which democracy itself is still evolving as a concept, and its processes of legitimization electorally are evolving as well. So I think I get to a point where I think it's good to look at shared concepts and definitions, but that striving for a single definition I find sort of counterproductive, yeah. So, but just to reflect.
Thank you, Joy. This is going to be our last intervention from the floor. Silvia, please.
My name is Silvia Cadena. I work at APNIC as the Grants and Awards Specialist. And I just wanted to make a comment about the evaluation mechanisms and how hard it is to incorporate an evaluation when a process is already ongoing and the evaluation was not considered in the first place. So is that digging on all computers, digging in all files, and digging in discussions that probably a lot of people have different pieces of the puzzle. So probably an evaluation going back might not be as effective because there is the framework was not built at the beginning, but not to say is not worth it. But it would be really good to also be a bit of forgiving and take into account that element of how difficult it might be to get all the evidence about the process and to make sure that to understand the linkages between actions that happen and events that happen and how you can actually attribute the benefit of those events or decisions or processes to the actual IGF. So I think it's very important that a framework for evaluation is shared in a way that people that are doing activities related to the IGF can start providing evidence from the future, from now on, about what activities are they doing, so it's easier to capture and to encourage people to also go back to their records and provide the evidence of all the processes before. The collection and the mechanisms to advertise this is not being made that public, probably. So a lot of, it should be good to make up some sort of awareness campaign to make sure that whomever is running the evaluation mechanisms has the information from as many actors as possible. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Chris, do you have a final comment or intervention for? I cut you off guard. Yeah, okay. Any reaction to this? John Deere, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Sebastian. I would like to comment on that as well as touch on some of the Pranish's points raised before. But my view is that, that I fully share the understanding that there's no common definition what multi-stakeholderism is. But, I think a multi-stakeholder approach is less about the groups of interest, is less about the people, is more about the process itself. It's about guaranteeing, like, everyone that takes part in a particular discussion, being an individual of a group or an organization, even a country, that there are ways and means for them to express their views and their concerns. And as long as these channels of communication exist, and not only exist, but that are fully recognized as legitimate by all parties involved, I think that this is a multi-stakeholder approach. It's about recognizing the other parties as legitimate in the process. Because if you take the multilateral approaches, when governments negotiate treaties, they see that non-government as sometimes as not a legitimate parties involved. They think that these other parties, they have to channel their concerns through the governments. And this is a different approach. So when you come to a multi-stakeholder effort, be it, like we mentioned, Net Mundial, we are here in the IGF, is the existence of these ways of these channels of communication that are seen as legitimate by all parties involved.
So is then multi-stakeholderism the same as participative democracy?
What I'm saying is that the beauty of this approach is the legitimacy of the parties involved. This I think what makes this so strong, and more than that, more than making it very strong, I think it addresses the issues in a way that can really be. I think we have to be creative in this, because especially if you take internet, we cannot use the 20th century tools to address the issues we have here in 21st century. Perhaps you have to be as creative as those who invented the internet to devise ways and means for these multi-stakeholder approaches. But I think the issue at stake is legitimacy. And this present here in IGF was there in São Paulo in Net Mundial. And I think this is the beauty of this exercise. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have time for a final remark and summary wrap-up of our panelists, and if you provide any kind of recommendation, big solution for all the problems of the human race or whatever, would be more than welcome. I will start with Joy now. No?
Yes, yes.
No?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I think one recommendation that I would encourage is to affirm this notion that we're in a process of change, and that that evolution and creation should be organic, it should be creative, it should be the best of what we have now that helps us keep growing into the future. And that is a kind of a value or a principle that we bring to these processes, as my colleague from Brazil has mentioned, of which I think Net Mundial is an excellent example. So that would be one. I think the other is that we must keep sharing best practice, lessons learned, not only what's worked, but what didn't work. You know, what are our frustrations with some of these processes? How can we share those in ways which are constructive and which help us build better better processes and better mechanisms going forward? So those would be my two. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bahar?
Thank you. I feel that here at the IGF this year there is kind of like a hidden theme that is taking the IGF into a more action-oriented kind of process, and that's absolutely a positive thing, and this is what we need to keep in mind as a community in thinking about the future and in thinking about moving beyond Net Mundial, how we could, I recognize that a lot has happened in the past years, many initiatives have been implemented. But I guess many out there are also looking for more action-oriented kind of initiatives or projects. And I think one thing we could I could propose as a recommendation, being from developing country or developing region. I think it's important to continue to promote and support national and regional multi-stakeholder initiatives and processes, whether they're being called IGF or something else, it doesn't really matter. But it's important to, as community, as internet governance community, as experts in the field, that we all support the establishment and the continuity of these processes, because without participation at national and regional levels, we will hardly get real participation from developing countries in forums like IGF, ICANN, any international fora. We can't reach effective participation from these regions without ensuring that they have the tools and the capacities and the resources to experience this kind of participation in their own countries and own regions. Thanks.
Thank you. Phil, would you like to give us your final thoughts, please?
I think, listening, one of the things that comes out from this discussion today is there is no one answer. I think there are many mechanisms that exist that we know about. As I said when I started, we need to gather more evidence. So if people think they have examples of mechanisms where multi-stakeholder cooperation is occurring, then we should encourage people to participate, and I'm willing to share the spreadsheet that has that. I think going forward, and as Bahir says, there's national, regional, international activities going on. We need to understand the separation, that what is core to our activities on what we think is the internet and what is in a different universe, where there are other activities that have their own central activities, but they impact upon what it is we are trying to have as a journey. You've heard about legitimacy, communication between these entities. I don't think, and I think I've heard nobody say, there should not be one mechanism or that sits above all other mechanisms. I think it's trying to understand how all the activities that we think we can identify can exist together.
Awesome, thank you very much. John Deere, please.
Thank you. In an effort to try to wrap up and just coming up with some few and concrete ideas after having listened to all of you is of course, just like Phil said, first be creative. There's no single solution. Internet is far too complex, and the challenges ahead are far too complicated and difficult. So, and the tools we have, this is a regime in the making. And then again, be creative. This is the first point I would like to make. The second, perhaps, will be ambitious and dare to sail in uncharted waters, because since you don't have an answer for all these questions, dare to innovate, and this requires this ambition. Be transparent. It adds confidence in the process, and people, the different groups and individuals, countries, and organizations, they'll feel that they are part of it. And be predictable, because then again, it adds confidence in the process. Like Net Mundial, we got to São Paulo, we knew what we were going to discuss, the documents were negotiated in advance, people provided contributions to that, and it was a predictable exercise. So then again, I think it's a lesson we can take it from Net Mundial. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mohammed.
With a little discussion about governance and liberal democracy, it was impossible not to think of that Churchill quote, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those others that we've been tried. And I wonder if that applies to governance. I'm not sure it does, or at least to multi-stakeholder governance the way we do it, because it very much is a trial and error process. I mean, it's not a stable, it's not a final process. It very much is, or at least I hope that all actors involved in it realize that it's not, you know, the holy grail of governance systems as they stand. So the multi-stakeholder process is somewhat flawed, but there's a balancing act here. There's the delicate balancing that needs to be done between, well, on one hand, we shouldn't be married sort of to the institutions and mechanisms that we have, because we need to acknowledge their flaws. At the same time, we should not succumb to the urge to build, you know, more layers of bureaucracy. So there's much more honesty with ourselves that is required here to figure out what the flaws are. What's wrong with them? What's wrong with multi-stakeholder process as it stands? And in doing this, you might know that there's a parallel forum that's happening in town tomorrow and the day after. So the Ungovernance Forum, and which I plan to go to, by the way. And I was reading the abstract of the conference, and a big part of the argumentation is that the IGF and the multi-stakeholder process, as it stands, is the problem itself, because it gives and disproportionate weight to many of the actors that are the causes of the problems of the internet governance as it stands. So, well, is this something that people here have considered? Why is this a criticism directed at this very forum? So yeah, so I mean, I was saying earlier that the internet evolves much faster than bureaucracy. It always will. And if we're going to stand a chance to have a governance systems that will be able to catch up, then we need much more honesty, and we need to involve all the voices that we can in that process. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all. I think it's been a great panel, and I'd like to thank you all for your insightful participation, and I think they deserve an applause. Okay, so we're closing now. And thank you all for coming, and so I think with this we're adjourned. Thank you very much.
answer?
Let's try. Let's do it. I'd love to.
That would, sorry. That would be great. I would really
Let's think about how. Okay, I need to run to another room now.
Sure.
But hold that thought. And thanks for your question, by the way. I'm pretty sure there's something to do with something.
says. Sound check. Ayakta mı yapalım yorumumuzu?
Mic check. Yok, ses yok şu an. Hayır hayır, sende değil. Mic check. Ses yok. Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Crandall, and I'm with Google. I handle global regulatory compliance at Google for Work, and I'm very proud to be with a panel of esteemed colleagues within the industry, public sector, and civil society. The name of this panel is Privacy, Surveillance, and the Cloud 1 year later. Now, in previous years, our workshops have looked at data flow, surveillance, and freedom of expression. As the world embraces the cloud business model, which we know is happening, we look at the cloud world 18 months after revelations of alleged mass government surveillance. We propose looking at how policymakers, regulators, cloud businesses, and users have responded to potential government access to user data in the cloud. So, what has been the resulting policy in all this time? What has the business world done to address these concerns? And what has worked and what hasn't? Has there been any impact in any of our efforts? We'll address how these measures have affected cloud adoption and explore potential solutions for addressing multi-stakeholder concerns in the post-revelation era. And I would like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves before we get started. Sarah?